Hello, and welcome back to Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup, and today we'll be finishing the history of Seacliff Mental Hospital in New Zealand. But don't worry, I'm not quite done with Seacliff yet. My main sources for this episode will be the History of Seacliff by Frank Tod and an anthology called Unfortunate Folk, Essays on Mental Health Treatment, 1863 to 1992, edited by Barbara Brookes and Jane Thomson. All other sources will be listed at the end of the episode transcript. Trigger warnings for this episode include outdated and ableist language, inhumane medical practices, and patient death. For now, come on in, get comfortable, as we go behind the walls of Seacliff Mental Hospital. We left off last week in 1920 after Dr. Truby King stepped down as superintendent of Seacliff so he could focus his time and attention on health care on a greater scale around New Zealand. Remember that Dr. King had been superintendent for 31 years. That is a really impressive tenure. The years following his departure wouldn't have nearly as much consistency or longevity. Dr. McKillop took Dr. King's place as superintendent in 1921. Like Dr. King, Dr. McKillop came with previous experience in psychiatric hospitals. He had been the medical superintendent at Nelson Mental Hospital on the northern side of the island. Now, just to zoom out for a bit, we have to remember that 1920 falls in the aftermath of World War I. The Great War had essentially shaken the world to its core, and new fears about death and mortality and strangers were taking their toll on society. One of the detrimental beliefs that was basically highlighted by the war was the fear of the unknown and the unfamiliar. Biologically, we're programmed to protect our group, whatever our group may be in that instance, against outsiders. And for much of the world, and certainly not just New Zealand alone, the focus became on preserving the bloodline and excluding anyone who didn't fit the image of normal. I talked about this briefly in the last episode, saying that Dr. Truby King was one who followed those beliefs. These beliefs became the basis of the eugenics movement. Throughout New Zealand and many other parts of the world, but for now I'm just focusing on New Zealand, there became a fear of, quote, mental defectives, people who, for one reason or another, didn't live up to society's expectations of typical behavior or typical mental functioning. And yes, it is not a great term to be using, since that is what was codified into law and medical practice. That's the term I'll be using, but I agree, it is icky. People believed that mental defectives were a threat to society, and the question became, well, how do we stop them from making more of them? In 1920, the prisons department actually attempted to provide some sort of a response to this question. The belief was that mental defectives were inherently more dangerous and prone to crime, so they would likely end up in prison. According to Stephen Robertson, quote, the low intelligence and lack of self-control that characterized mental defectives left them unable to exercise moral judgment, end quote. Or so people believed. So the prison board called for, quote, scientific treatment in the form of medical examinations before sentencing, as well as an indeterminate sentence and the segregation and treatment of prisoners, which included medical or surgical treatment, including sterilization. Particularly poignant in this discussion was the issue of segregating mental defectives. The prison department believed that mental defectives would eventually segregate themselves by committing crime and ending up incarcerated. The education department thought that segregation should begin earlier in the childhood years. Since 1914, the education department had been made responsible for children deemed, quote, backward and defective. Backward children was a new horrible term for me. Apparently, these were children who for reason of illness or family concerns or some other reason, had missed so much school that they were essentially anywhere from 1 to 3 years behind in their development. This may be a typically functioning student who had an ill parent, so it's no fault of their own that they couldn't make it to school. The education department wanted to weed out backward children who could reasonably make up their educational deficits with defective children who were behind because of their mental functioning or because of their behavior that interfered with their ability to learn along with their peers. These defective children fell under the umbrella of the feeble-minded, which was legally considered to be a mental illness. It's been about 20 episodes already since we've discussed these terms, so they're worth a revisit. I mentioned the category of feeble-mindedness in episode 1 on Oregon State Hospital, episode 8 on Fairview Training Center, and episode 41 on Kew Lunatic Asylum. In short, the terms idiot, imbecile, and moron were all clinical terms indicating different levels of intelligence, and they were all under the category of feeble-mindedness. Someone given the diagnosis of an idiot had the most profound intellectual deficits, with the abilities of someone aged 2 and under. The term imbecile indicated someone with the mental age of 3 to 7 years, and the term moron indicated someone with the mental age of approximately 8 to 12 years. So the question of what to do with mental defectives became sort of a territorial issue. Who was responsible for managing this group? Was it the education system by separating them early on and preparing them to be well-adjusted members of society? Was it the prison system, since they obviously had no self-control and would inevitably commit crime anyway? Or was it the mental institutions, since all of this fell under the umbrella of mental illness? But was it really a mental illness? Who was going to solve this terrible issue? Like I mentioned earlier, the prisons were ready with their version of medical or surgical treatment. The education department came along in 1922 by establishing a school for idiots and imbeciles near Nelson Mental Hospital. Doing this pushed responsibility for this group away from the mental hospitals and toward the education department, showing that feeble-mindedness was something truly separate from mental illness. In fact, Seacliff transferred a number of its patients over to the new school for idiots and imbeciles, which only served to reinforce the idea that they had separate needs from their patients. The new school had a brand new tool at its disposal to help distinguish who could be educated with assistance and who could not. This was the IQ test. Starting in 1923, intelligence tests started to be used to determine who needed to be transferred to the special school. And we'll come back to the issue of mental defectives in a little bit. But there was renewed interest in how to treat folks who didn't quite fit neatly into the box of mentally ill. In 1924, the Mental Hospitals Reform Association was formed to, quote, gain separate and special treatment for borderline cases of insanity, end quote. Borderline here is used in the Freudian sense. He believed in 3 categories of mental functioning: psychotic on one end, which was a genuine mental illness; neurotic on the other end, which was a sort of normative level of anxiety and depression; and borderline, which fell in between and was above a normal level of anxiety and depression, but not truly psychotic. So the issue came back to, what do we do with these people who fall between the cracks? And in 1925, a new type of treatment was used to alleviate symptoms of mild to severe mental illness: malaria shots. This was something else we addressed early on in the show during the series on Oregon State Hospital. It was originally used for folks with late-stage syphilis who were presenting with symptoms of general paralysis of the insane, which are similar to symptoms of dementia: memory problems, quick personality changes, trembling, slurred speech, etc. The malaria shot would induce a high fever, killing off the syphilitic spirochetes. It wouldn't cure the person of syphilis, but it would mitigate their symptoms. And using this method, doctors noticed that it also appeared effective for folks with mild to severe mental illness. So it quickly became a trend to use malaria shots to treat psychosis. Given the new treatments available and the work of mental hospitals, the Mental Hospital Reform Association, policymakers were beginning to see that not everyone needed to be locked up at Seacliff indefinitely. Outpatient psychiatric clinics were set up at general hospitals in an attempt to avoid having to send folks to Seacliff and other mental hospitals. The law was changed so that now commitment to a mental hospital had to be conducted by 2 doctors, one from a mental hospital, one from a general hospital. This was a significant advance, since it meant that patients could be treated outside mental hospitals. And I'll point out that this is very early in comparison to other countries I've studied so far. In 1925, Dr. McKillop left Seacliff for Sunnyside Hospital in Christchurch, and Dr. Gribben took his place. Just an aside here to say that 1925 was also a significant year for Dr. Truby King. Not only was he appointed Inspector General of Mental Hospitals, but he was knighted for his services to healthcare. Sir Truby King would serve 2 more years until his retirement in 1927. He later died on February 10, 1938, and was the first private citizen in New Zealand to receive a state funeral. The end of the 1920s brought the Great Depression, which tightened the strings of finances at the hospital even more. It continued to be overcrowded and understaffed, all the while trying to redirect patients to the special school for idiots and imbeciles or to the clinics in the community. When new clinics opened up around New Zealand, there weren't enough doctors to staff them, so 3 doctors were recruited from England to manage the new centers. This would not be the last time they had to recruit from abroad. In 1928, the Mental Defectives Act, which had been originally signed into law in 1911, was amended. This allowed patients to voluntarily admit themselves to the hospital without being committed. The idea was that people could seek out proactive treatment. The amendments also removed mental defectives from admission to mental hospitals. According to Susan Fennell, quote, 2 psychiatric clinics were established under a centralized eugenics board, which could take referrals from the courts and the Department of Education, Health, and Prisons, as well as from individuals, and decide whether cases should be classified as mentally defective, end quote. In 1929, a farm was started in Templeton near Christchurch for education of children deemed mentally defective. By 1930, there were 144 children residing there. In 1929, Dr. Gribben left Seacliff and Dr. Childs became superintendent in his place. Remember, I had mentioned that after Sir Truby King left, there would be a lot of changes in leadership over the following years. I imagine, and this is purely speculative, that the changes at the hospital, like overcrowding, understaffing, and underfunding, made it extremely difficult to navigate running the hospital efficiently. There's also still the issue of the instability of the building itself due to erosion. This never ceased being a problem, and authorities were still aware of the issue, although it was largely on the back burner during this time, since more pressing issues were at hand. In 1930, a new kitchen, laundry, and stores block was built. Clearly, if they were investing funds into those projects, they were necessary. In 1932, Dr. Childs left Seacliff, and Dr. Hayes became superintendent in his place. At the time he took over, there were over 1,200 patients at Seacliff. Again, authorities were trying to devise ways to keep staff, particularly doctors, at the hospital. In 1934, it was decided that doctors' salaries were raised, or would be raised, from £650 per year to £900 per year. They were raised again in 1936 and 1937, but they were still paid less than in general practice. In 1935, the Labour government came to power in New Zealand. This change started a progressive movement throughout the country, leading to a number of significant social reforms and policy changes. Inpatient treatment became free for all, and outpatient treatment became free and more easily accessible for the entire population. The living standard across the country improved, and the infant mortality rate decreased significantly. By 1936, there were about 1,400 patients at Seacliff. Overcrowding, which had been a consistent problem, was worsened after the women's ward of the main building had to be demolished that year. There had been too much erosion in the foundation for the building to continue being used safely. I would imagine that serious talks began around this time about what they were going to do with all the patients at the hospital and a building that was quite literally crumbling beneath them. In 1937, Superintendent Hayes died, and Dr. Malcolm Brown took his place. Dr. Brown would remain at Seacliff for 15 years. The following year, in 1938, in an attempt to mitigate staffing shortages, 12 medical officers were recruited from Britain, and 2 of them came to Seacliff. For a short while, the hospital was fully staffed with doctors. It must have felt like such a relief. Then World War II began, and staff left to help with the war effort. After a brief respite, the staffing shortage was back and worse than ever. In fact, 4 medical officers and 100 other staff left for war service. As Susan Fennell says, quote, male staff were replaced by temporaries, and wives of attendants who had volunteered were employed to help overcome the shortage of female staff. However, this could not create a full complement, end quote. Women in Otago were drafted throughout the war to help with the staffing at the hospital because shortages had become so acute. It occurs to me as I'm writing this that there had to have been patients, both men and women, I imagine, who wished that they could participate in the war effort. We know there were patients at basically any mental hospital around this time who were mentally stable enough that they really didn't have to be there. No doubt there were patients who were restless, wishing they could go and be helpful rather than being stuck at Seacliff. And maybe there's some accuracy to this, I don't actually know. But for whatever reason, the patient population at Seacliff declined after the war began. There had been 1,400 patients in 1936, and by 1940, there were 1,014. So maybe some were able to leave? Or perhaps some of the voluntary patients left to be with their families? I'm not entirely sure, but that's a significant drop. In terms of treatment during this time, there were some changes. In 1939, insulin shock therapy had been introduced at Seacliff. We've talked about this in previous episodes, but as a refresher, this treatment was used on folks with psychosis. They would be injected with insulin in order to induce a seizure and coma. This was done daily, according to Susan Fennell, from anywhere from 6 weeks to 2 months. I cannot imagine the absolute fear that patients must have experienced during this therapy, especially for such a long duration. Obviously, we don't know how we would react until we're in a situation like that, but I imagine for myself that I would probably resist being taken for treatment. Like, no, that was horrible. I'm bruised. My mind felt foggy. Don't do it again. And then having multiple staff come in and extract me from my room just to force me to go through it all again and again. I mean, the thought is absolutely unbearable. Now, I imagine that had to have been the case for some patients, but some patients did see improvement. Susan Fennell writes, quote, of the 30 cases treated with insulin by 1940, 1/3 had been able to leave the hospital. 1/3 showed improvement but still had to remain in the hospital, and the remaining third showed no response. In cases under 18 months duration, 71% showed a full remission and 86% were able to leave the hospital. Other improved cases showed the ability to look after themselves and to enjoy recreations and entertainments, end quote. For better or for worse, I'm not sure, Insulin shock treatment had to be paused during the staffing shortages of World War II. It would be picked back up again in 1948. Somehow, though, insulin shock therapy was not the most inhumane treatment used at the time. In 1939, cortisol shock treatment was introduced in New Zealand. And we've discussed this before using the name metrazole shock treatment. This is the same thing, just a different name. Metrazole was similar to insulin therapy in that patients were injected with metrazole, which induced a grand mal seizure. Often the seizures were so violent that patients would break limbs while they were being restrained. Metrazole shock treatment showed promising and satisfactory results on catatonics, stupros, and paranoid schizophrenics. A few patients with schizophrenia were treated with metrazole at Seacliff, but Dr. Brown favored insulin shock treatment there. The early 1940s was a time of experimentation in treatment. Around New Zealand, not just at Seacliff, electric narcosis was starting to be used. This was an early predecessor of electroconvulsive therapy. It had originally been discovered, if you will, in the early 1900s by use in animals to produce a narcotic-like state. This began being used around the country, and by 1946, over 500 cases had been treated using this method. Electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, started being used in New Zealand in 1943, but wasn't introduced to Seacliff until 1945. By 1948, ECT was being used commonly. Susan Fennell said, quote, "It produced good results with affective psychoses and startling success in involutional melancholiacs, now known as endogenous depression." Dr. Malcolm Brown believed that ECT played a large part in the increasing discharge rate that was becoming obvious at Seacliff in the later 1940s, end quote. Remember, we'd said that in 1940, the patient population had dropped to just over 1,000 patients. By 1946, it had dropped to 961 patients. 1945 was also the year that the prefrontal leucotomy was introduced. It was performed on 3 patients at Seacliff, although none of them showed dramatic improvements, although 2 of them were eventually able to leave the hospital. Dr. Brown approved 3 more patients in 1946 for the procedure. By 1948, the leucotomy was being used for some cases of schizophrenia and perpetual mania. I do appreciate that this surgery didn't take off in New Zealand at the same rate as it did in the US. It seemed like doctors had a healthy level of skepticism and really looked at the results to justify its use. And since it wasn't able to prove its worth, it wasn't used on a large scale. If only that had been the case in the US. Other non-invasive therapies were being introduced during World War II, including occupational therapy. In 1942, 2 occupational therapists joined the ranks at Seacliff. According to Susan Fennell, occupational therapy, quote, alleviated the restlessness of patients confined indoors, and authorities mentioned a tranquilizing effect. It was obviously aiding recovery, and patients showed a new interest in life. By 1941, occupational therapy was being used throughout New Zealand, and in 1946 was mentioned by all mental hospitals in their annual reports. Much enthusiasm was shown. Where it was not already being used, suitable staff were soon to be appointed, end quote. I'm sure engaging patients in enjoyable activities was beneficial in many ways. They were likely able to improve their social skills, be productive by making things, and feel a sense of purpose. All of that is very healing and far less nerve-wracking than the invasive procedures. And then tragedy struck. Around 9:45 p.m. on December 8, 1942, an attendant was walking near Ward 5, also called the Simla building, when he noticed a fire blazing in the dormitory where 39, quote, difficult women patients were housed. He quickly called for the fire department, who, along with other staff, arrived to fight the blaze. But there was one major problem, and trigger warning, it is disturbing. In some of the buildings, including Ward 5, Patients were locked in at night, and attendants only checked on them once per hour. Yeah, they were locked in from the outside. There was a fire alarm, but it had to be manually unlocked to be used. I can only imagine the fear those women must have had once the fire started and knowing there was no way they could escape. Frank Tod describes the fire like this, quote, "The blaze was so fierce that it was humanly impossible to get near enough to the building to rescue any of the occupants, although attempts were made. A strong southerly wind quickly turned the building into a blazing inferno. The glow of the fire was seen as far away as Dunedin and Palmerston. After the alarm was given, staff members evacuated patients from nearby buildings." End quote. Miraculously, 2 of the women were able to be rescued from the fire through windows they were able to open. The survivors had sustained horrific burns, but they were alive. The following morning, Frank Tod notes, quote, "The scene of the fire was a sad picture, a mass of twisted iron bedsteads, roofing iron, and charred wood," end quote. 37 of the 39 women who lived in Ward 5 died in the fire. At the time, it was the worst loss of life from fire in New Zealand history. Immediately, there were theories on what started the fatal blaze. There were no fireplaces. The building was steam heated. So an inquest into the fire revealed no definitive cause, but the initial theory remained. It was likely crossed electrical wires caused by erosion under the building. Once again, the erosion under Seacliff was causing problems, this time with deadly and devastating consequences. It was now imperative to move the hospital and its 1,000 patients somewhere else. But, as these things tend to go, it wouldn't happen quickly. In 1945, more erosion damaged part of the main building. This time it was the women's day room and dining room that were damaged. Frank Tod cites this descriptive excerpt from the Otago Daily Times, quote, "The day room and dining room in the women's part were badly damaged by further slips. The western wall is convex, with the result that from the northwestern corner of the room, the bulge in the wall makes it impossible for one to see the southwestern corner. Doors are out of plumb, windows jam, cracks have appeared in the ceiling beams and walls, and 2 fireplaces in the room have had to be replaced with central stoves. The ground is not merely slipping, but it's skewing in its movement, with the result that strange twists have been given to walls and doors." End quote. We have to remember that the building is over 60 years old at this point, and there were significant issues with it before construction even finished. This wasn't a new problem, it was a worsened problem. And the main building wasn't the only place noticing the effects of long-term erosion. Quote, "The exercise yard beyond the day room has also been affected by the ground movement, and cracks and depressions have developed in the tar-sealed surface that was only recently leveled. Some time ago, the male staff quarters further up the hill, and locally known as the ranch, were twisted so much that it was not possible to obtain a clear view through the central corridor because of the movement of the walls. This wooden building was returned to normal by the use of powerful jacks." End quote. In an attempt to alleviate the problem, temporary structures were built to accommodate patients. And starting in 1945, contractors started to demolish the unsafe parts of the building. According to Frank Tod, quote, "The tower, with many of its ornamental hanging turrets and battlements and heavy stone gables which made the building so picturesque, disappeared." End quote. That same year in 1945, an area north of Seacliff called Cherry Farm was chosen as the site of the new mental hospital. It was carefully surveyed to ensure proper drainage and a good water and sewer system. They invested $500,000 to ensure that the site would not have the same problems that the original Seacliff building had experienced for decades. Many changes to the hospital were made in the aftermath of World War II. But notably, before we get to those, New Zealand finally and fully gained its independence in 1947. With that came a number of legal changes, namely the Health Amendment Act, which established a division of mental hygiene within the health department. This essentially showed the public that mental health issues were being taken more seriously. At Seacliff, this meant improved amenities for patients. Frank Tod describes these at length. Quote, "The government made a grant of $40,000 entirely for the comfort of patients. More pocket money, improved furnishings, and a departure from the standardization of institutional clothing was particularly welcomed. A hospital canteen was established and sold the usual run of goods, sweets, tobacco, soft drinks, etc. And for patients, there were even such essentials as lipstick and powder. Profits from the canteen were paid into the patient's recreation fund, which provided such extras as trips to town." End quote. I know for my patients that trips to the canteen are the highlight of the week. It's interesting and also kind of sad how buying something they want, even if it's just their favorite type of potato chip, can bring so much joy. So I can only imagine that these new additions to the hospital were very welcome for the patients at Seacliff. A social worker was added to the staff in 1948, which added more resources to patients hoping to return to the community. In 1948, the hospital celebrated the 65th anniversary of its opening. According to Frank Tod, quote, "Hundreds of former staff members from all parts of the country were welcomed to the celebrations by the medical superintendent, Dr. Brown. A dinner was held in the hospital dining hall, and in the evening, the hospital hall was packed for the grand ball," end quote. 65 years seems like sort of an odd anniversary to mark, but I have a feeling that it was symbolic for looking back on what had been and looking forward to what was to come. The hospital had acquired more land at Cherry Farm, so movement was happening in regard to the new hospital space. By 1952, Dr. Malcolm Brown stepped down as superintendent after 15 years on the job, and Dr. Jeffrey Blake Palmer took his place. Dr. Blake Palmer was a highly decorated physician with medals and prizes and military honors, not to mention lots of experience in psychiatric hospitals. It was Dr. Blake Palmer who would help transition Seacliff into its next phase. In 1952, construction began on Cherry Farm, which was located 50 kilometers north of Dunedin. This wouldn't be a large, imposing structure like most hospitals, though. Cherry Farm would be New Zealand's first therapeutic community and have multiple semi-autonomous villas on the compound. The changing viewpoints about mental health and mental health treatment contended that facilities for the mentally ill shouldn't be merely warehousing patients, but having them live and work together in order to transition back to the community. Starting in December 1953, Cherry Farm began receiving patients to do just that. Some of the benefits of this new style of hospital were that patients had more freedom and autonomy. They were smaller in size with a community center. The public was encouraged to visit, and the work was done by hospital staff at outpatient clinics. Of course, with change comes fear of the unknown. The public soon became afraid that their dangerous and unpredictable new neighbors, showing that there was still a stigma surrounding folks with mental illness. The first patients at Cherry Farm likely didn't have criminal histories at all. The intent was to keep the most dangerous and volatile patients at Seacliff as long as possible. The patients at Cherry Farm were ready to work toward discharge to the community, but, and this is true today, there's a trope about the axe-wielding murderer who escapes from the loony bin, when in actuality, most patients at psychiatric hospitals would be way more of a danger to themselves than to anyone else. The mid-1950s, we have to remember, is also the time when psychotropic medications were introduced to hospitals, leading to an increased number of discharges. I imagine that this also helped facilitate the transfer of patients between Seacliff and Cherry Farm. Patients who are more psychiatrically stable on medications were likely able to manage their own needs more effectively. In 1959, the time had finally come for the old hospital building to be demolished. It had held on long past its expiration date. Frank Tod describes it as follows, quote, "The main building was described by the contractors as looking like a bomb victim with its gutted interior, blank windows and gray walls, bricks toppling from corner turrets, white skeleton gable trusses bared to the sky, workmen in tin hats, and a large number of displaced cats that suddenly appeared, routed from their former homes under the building." And just a side note here to say that it's a good thing I wasn't there. I have a penchant for stealing kittens from state hospitals. And that's all I'll say about that. Back to the quote. In December 1959, 80 years of history crumbled in about 2 hours when a demolition team brought the central block of the main building tumbling down. 3 giant tractors strained the corner supports of the already weakened structure with wire stops to collapse the building section by section. Finally, the walls succumbed to the strain, end quote. This had to be a bittersweet feeling, watching so many years of history come tumbling down, but it must have also signaled the hope of a new way of treating patients at Cherry Farm. In 1960, Dr. Blake Palmer stepped down as superintendent of Seacliff in order to become the director of the Division of Mental Hygiene. Dr. Charles S. Moore, who'd been a senior medical officer at Seacliff since 1958, was appointed in his place over Seacliff and Cherry Farm. And also, just as an aside, Dr. Moore looks a whole lot like Donald Sutherland, who just passed away this week as I record. I'll put some side-by-side pictures up on Facebook and Instagram and see what you think. They have almost the exact same pointy eyebrows. Anyway, I digress. Let me know what you think. In 1961, the Mental Health Amendment Bill brought new changes to the voluntary admissions process, as well as the discharge process. It would also offer other community-based options, such as opening day rooms in general hospitals. By 1964, Seacliff stopped taking new admissions, as they were phasing out their population and slowly moving patients to Cherry Farm or out to the community. The focus became making stays at Cherry Farm as short-term as was feasible for each patient. In 1965, a hospital in Wakari was converted into a psychiatric unit to add more options for patients, especially those remaining in Seacliff, to go. By the following year, the psychiatric program at Wakari was treating 400 patients per year who stayed an average of 20 days each. The model was really changing from institutionalizing patients to treating and discharging them. The problem was, now there were 3 facilities in the Otago region instead of 1. This made staffing extremely limited. This was an issue all around New Zealand as well. In the UK, there was 1 doctor for every 133 psychiatric patients, but in New Zealand, it was 1 doctor to every 310 patients. They had only filled 50% of the physician vacancies recommended by the World Health Organization. Adding more facilities was nice for separating patients by psychiatric need, but not so great for staffing and economics. By 1965, there were already 1,365 patients at Cherry Farm. There was a lot of criticism by administrators and the public about overcrowding and still relying too heavily on institutions to treat mental illness. Some folks pointed to the deinstitutionalization movement happening in the US and the UK and wanted to follow their examples. If I were there, I'd say, no, don't follow their examples. They're moving patients out too quickly. Keep doing what you're doing. But there was a push to move patients out to the group homes in the community. In some cases, patients were able to get jobs working in industries prior to discharge so that they left with some real-world experience. This proved to be really effective pre-discharge plans for many patients. The problem that Seacliff and Cherry Farm faced was that so many of their patients had been at the hospital for so long that they had become institutionalized. They didn't really know how to live in the community again. So relapse was common among patients who left during the 1960s. By 1969, the population at Cherry Farm had decreased to 676 patients. The focus of the 1970s then became how Cherry Farm could better prepare patients for their return to the community. This was made somewhat easier by transferring control of the county's mental hospitals to local hospital boards rather than state-run ones. According to Jeff Kavanaugh, quote, in December 1971, the Otago Hospital Board formally agreed to accept responsibility for the administration of Cherry Farm Hospital, Orokonui, and what remained of Seacliff. The hospital board now controlled all of Otago's mental health services, including the small inpatient facility at Wakari Hospital, end quote. This is significant because now the local board can make decisions specific to their hospitals, and I imagine they would have a better sense of what their facilities needed. In 1972, after 90 years, Seacliff Mental Hospital closed. The remaining patients transferred to the community or to other facilities. Cherry Farm absorbed some of the patients, and their total roster had increased to 1,000 patients. Throughout the 1970s, approximately 350 medical, administrative, and nursing staff worked at Cherry Farm. The main intent of treatment at Cherry Farm, as I'd mentioned earlier, was to help patients transfer successfully to the community. A small ward there was designed for 4 to 6 patients who had been identified as discharge ready. Kavanaugh points out, quote, there they would be trained to look after themselves, doing their own shopping, and gaining a measure of independence to prepare them for moving into a house in the community, end quote. And they'd stay there for about 6 months, getting ready to leave. And this, I think, is brilliant, and I wish we saw this more often at state hospitals today. Patients need to learn skills to be independent before going back and living on their own. It can be really overwhelming to return to a world that feels kind of familiar, but you haven't really lived in years. That was part of the reason why Cherry Farm focused on short-term stays for many new admissions. The average stay was 3 to 4 weeks, so they didn't necessarily need to relearn all those skills for community living. In spite of their many good intentions, Cherry Farm received a lot of criticism from members of the public and administration. It was, in sum, expensive to keep it running when many of the patients were mentally stable enough and safe enough to return to the community and use outpatient services. In August 1977, Cherry Farm stopped admitting new patients since there was a bed shortage, and there were 930 patients at Cherry Farm at the time. In September 1977, Dr. Moore / Donald Sutherland resigned as superintendent of Cherry Farm. It had been too difficult to keep staff working there for one, and for another, it looked like New Zealand was moving toward eliminating most mental hospitals altogether. Dr. Moore had defended keeping mental hospitals, noting that following the examples of the US and UK may not be a good idea. After all, they seem to be discharging patients too quickly into the community. By 1980, the plan to start cutting back on psychiatric beds was in place. Within the next couple of years, the plan was to close 3 villas at Cherry Farm and 3 at Orokonui Hospital, so there would be 248 fewer beds for a total of 665 patients. Within 4 years after that, the number would be further decreased to 528 beds. The plan was for that the money saved would go toward mental health resources in the community. In the late 1970s, more group homes had emerged in and around Dunedin. Most of the early group homes had been in suburbs, but in 1983, a new one was established in the inner city. It was close to services and potential employment, with the hope that patients could be more autonomous with minimal supervision. By 1984, the director of the Department of Health stated that large psychiatric hospitals should be reduced to a maximum number of 200 beds within the next 20 years. This was mostly for financial reasons, but also with the hopes of relocating patients to the community. In an attempt to condense resources, Kavanaugh says, Cherry Farm was restructured into distinct sub-hospitals for, quote, mentally handicapped, psychogeriatric, and psychiatric patients, end quote. The hope was that each group could get more individualized care and save some money along the way. And it helped, for a while. 2 years later, by June 1986, more cuts were announced. Cherry Farm would have to reduce its capacity from 510 beds to as low as 250 beds. They accomplished this by moving folks with developmental disorders to another facility and geriatric patients to Akari Hospital. At this point, with so many changes, I can't imagine this would have been good for patient care or for patient morale, for that matter. But staff and patients at Cherry Farm were reassured throughout all the cuts that their facility would be saved. But in December 1990, the Otago Area Health Board announced that psychiatric services would be shifted to Akari Hospital. It seemed to be the beginning of the end for Cherry Farm. And then in 1992, the inevitable did finally happen. Cherry Farm was closed after 40 years of service. Jeff Kavanaugh discusses the options that were available for patients returning to the community. Quote, community care services then included 18 full-time staff members to provide care for 540 clients, a social and rehabilitation center, an activity center in Custafin, a supervised boarding house of 16 beds, flats operated by the hospital board with 19 more beds, 27 private licensed boarding houses, and $780,000 for voluntary organizations caring for the mentally ill. Although these efforts were praiseworthy, the reliance of 540 people on fewer than 30 houses and less than 20 staff is indicative of the underfunded state of mental health services in Dunedin. Ideally, there should have been a wide range of professional services, from employment training programs to more institutional care for those not coping in the community. Ex-patients often moved into large boarding houses that resembled the villa-style living of Cherry Farm, in that they lived in significant numbers together and shared basic facilities. The boarding houses also often managed the ex-patients' funds. Community care became similar to life at Cherry Farm without the constant care and surveillance of medical staff, end quote. In the years since Seacliff and Cherry Farm closed, both sites have gone on to be repurposed, in a sense. Cherry Farm was renamed Hawkesbury, most likely in an attempt to distance itself from its past as a psychiatric facility. Today, Hawkesbury Village is a privately owned and managed residential village. There are still a few buildings that were part of Cherry Farm, and some former villas have been converted into residences. Hawkesbury is home to a church, a community pool, a cheese factory, and a meat factory. As for the grounds where Seacliff once stood, not much is left. There's a handful of buildings that remain, but they're on privately owned land and are inaccessible. According to writer Louise Fisher, quote, the land surrounding the main building is owned by the city of Dunedin and is now the Truby King Recreation Reserve. The last remaining buildings on the site was demolished in 1992, leaving behind little more than foundations, end quote. And that is where I will end the history of Seacliff Mental Hospital. Now, if you're from New Zealand or otherwise familiar with the story of Seacliff, you may notice that I've omitted two well-known patients from the story thus far. But don't worry, those are coming up in the next 2 episodes. So next week, I will be telling the story of an infamous murderer who lived at Seacliff and caused all sorts of mischief. So get yourself ready for another true crime episode. And after that, I'll be telling the story of a different type of patient, one who barely escaped getting a lobotomy. So more on that story in 2 weeks. As always, thank you so much for listening. Thanks to everyone who joined the Facebook group and Instagram page this week. I encourage you to check out my Patreon page for some additional content that's now available. You can access that content for as little as $5 a month, and I'll be adding more very soon. Most importantly, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you are listening. But super extra bonus points, I always say, if that's on Apple Podcasts. I really appreciate that a lot. It helps new listeners find the show. Also, I've had a few people use the send me a message or text me a message option when you listen. Just be aware that I don't have the ability to respond to those or even see who wrote them, but I do read them. So if you have a message that you'd like me to respond to, I encourage you to send me an email at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. Thank you again so much for listening. Please come back next week for our true crime episode. And of course, remember, do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. Cover image is by Christopher Payne. Check out my website at behindthewallspodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow the podcast and learn more on Facebook at Behind the Walls Podcast and Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. For questions or recommendations, email me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can find new episodes every Monday on Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find and listen to the show, and I would be so grateful. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. Until next time.